Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing reminds me of a breakfast I had with Antonin Scalia. About a dozen of us congressmen invited him to breakfast, and this was about a decade ago when Obama was the president and John Boehner was the speaker. And my colleagues appealed to Scalia and said, what can you do? You need to get involved here. The courts need to get involved. Obama's running roughshod over Congress. And Scalia refused to accept that premise. He said, no, this is not my job to referee fights between your two branches. My job is as a jurist to decide if somebody's been harmed and what the remedy is, and occasionally we interpret the law and the constitutionality of it. He said, and by the way, you're the most powerful branch of government. I don't know what you're complaining about. All the tools you need to restore the balance are in the Constitution. And one of my colleagues protested that impeachment was just too hard to pull off, given the threshold in the Senate and the political backlash. And Scalia shook his head. He said, I'm not talking about impeachment. You all have the power of the purse. You are funding everything you complain about that Obama is doing. Just quit funding it. And it was a pretty clear message. Now, that was about tension between Congress and the executive branch, and our hearing today is about tension between the judicial system and the executive branch. But I think it's still the case that what Scalia said is true. Let me give you an example of something I'm going to predict is going to happen in the courts soon that I'm not going to have much sympathy for on the president. So the president recently had a press conference and said he's going to wind down the Department of Education. Oh, great, that's my bill. I've got a one-sentence bill that eliminates the Department of Education. I should be very excited about this. The problem is, much of the activity that he says he will undertake, he just signed into law the funding of it a week before. We did a continuing resolution that fully funds every single penny of the Department of Education then a week, and the president signed it. This is, as Professor Shaw pointed out, appropriations bills are laws too, and they require both chambers and then the president to sign it. And so it's an appropriation bill, it's a law, it's in law, and a week later he announces that he doesn't like some of the law, and so he's going to do things differently. So that's my problem that I have. Now, I do think it's a good hearing, and this is a great question. I tend to think that probably there are cases where they shouldn't have nationwide injunctions, but this is a double-edged sword. Under the Biden administration, he did unconstitutional and unlawful things during COVID that were stopped with nationwide injunctions. So, for instance, he had a rent moratorium that was stopped until the Supreme Court eventually basically said it was illegal. He refused to grant religious exemptions to the vaccines in the military. There was a nationwide injunction. Actually, one of the attorneys in that is a constituent of mine, Chris Wiest, who stopped all of the vaccine mandates at that point in the Air Force. That was a nationwide injunction. And then his OSHA vaccine mandate was stopped with a nationwide injunction. So I'm torn on this. Maybe if we just don't have nationwide injunctions, people in certain districts can live under tyranny or the perception of it. And if you're in a different judicial district or circuit, you get some remedy from the tyranny. Maybe it works out better that way. Maybe we should have tried each of these cases in each of these courts and found out the answer. But Mr. Speaker, former Speaker Newt Gingrich, what do you have to say on since you were Speaker and led this appropriations process, do you think the president can unwind the Department of Education a week after he signed the bill that funded it? Yield to.
Well, as you know, when I was Speaker, we balanced the budget, something you believe in, for 4 straight years, the only time in the last century. So I think I can talk with some authority about this. I suspect there will be a real fight at the Supreme Court level over whether or not the president has impoundment authority, which was taken away during the collapse of the Nixon presidency, but had existed before that. That'll be a legal fight. I think your point about injunctions is semi-right. That is, a court should be able to issue the injunction. My point about this, the Chief Justice is, if that particular single district judge says, this is a valid injunction, if they immediately went to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court agreed that it was a valid injunction, then you could have a nationwide injunction. But I'm with Lincoln, who said even though the court had decided 7-2 that slavery could be extended nationally, he refused to accept the legitimacy of that decision because it wasn't unanimous. Now, so the precedent is pretty clear. I think your instinct is right. There are times you need a nationwide action. My only point is, if the district judge says that, the following morning it should be in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court should have to render judgment. If they agree, then you have a nationwide injunction. But if they say, no, you're in error, then there's no nationwide injunction.
Makes sense to me. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. We now go to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin.